acid-base behavior and chemical structure. Before viewing this video, students should have already read 1610 in Brown-Lemay and studied the corresponding notes. In looking at two acids, HCl, hydrochloric acid, and acetic acid, we know that HCl fully ionizes while acetic acid doesn't. There's a Ka associated with each of these acids. The Ka for HCl would be large, and the Ka for acetic acid would be small. For this reason, we call HCl a strong acid, and we call acetic acid a weak acid. Remember that these terms, strong and weak, are all about an acid's tendency to ionize, not about the concentration of the acid. If we ask the question, why are some acids stronger than others, remember that we're always starting in knowing something about an experimental observation. In this case, we know that HCl fully ionizes. We also know the small degree to which the acetic acid ionizes. Let's take a look at some factors that influence acid strength. The three most important factors are bond strength, electron withdrawing ability of the base, and stability of the conjugate base. We know that in order for an acid to ionize, the bond between the H and the ion or anion in the acid would need to be broken. There's an energy associated with breaking any bond, and that energy would have to be overcome for the ionization to occur. For the ions to separate, we also know that there would have to be a shift in electron density. Minus would have to be pulled away from the H. That minus would ultimately reside on the anion alone. In the case of HCl, Cl would be pulling minus out of the bond, and that minus would ultimately be present on the Cl. For this reason, it's important that a strong acid have a conjugate base with a high degree of electron withdrawing ability. Typically, this occurs in a polar bond when one of the atoms, one or more of the atoms in the anion is very electronegative. Finally, the last consideration is the stability of the conjugate base. After ionization occurs, an H plus and the resulting anion are by themselves. The resulting anion, the conjugate base, has to be stable. Typically, this involves the ability of that anion to hold negative charge. Ions with a high propensity to hold negative charge are ions that typically come from strong acids. Also, it tends to be helpful for an anion to be able to spread out that negative charge. In the case of Cl, we know that it makes a good conjugate base, one that's very stable on its own, because we know that Cl- would be something common to see in solution. After chlorine gains an additional electron, it has a filled outer shell and ends up being much lower in energy. With all this in mind, the trends identified in figure 16.18 are no surprise, especially the trend going across the periodic table. We're not surprised to see as we go to the right toward more electronegative anions that the acid strength increases. What may be a little bit surprising is what happens as we go down the group. Notice that hydrofluoric acid, HF, is actually a weak acid. This would be very surprising if acid strength was determined by electronegativity alone, since fluorine is the most electronegative atom. However, remember that acid strength comes from a variety of factors. And in the case of HF, the ions are so small and so close together that the bond energy is very high and very difficult to overcome. Also, as we go down group 7A, we end up with anions, conjugate bases, that are larger and larger. These conjugate bases are likely better able to hold the negative charge that resides on them after ionization occurs. Oxyanions, like chlorite and chlorate, make oxyacids. There's a trend in oxyacid strength that's demonstrated in the figure shown. We're not surprised to see that perchloric is the strongest of the acids shown, because perchloric's conjugate base has a lot of electron withdrawing groups, very polar oxygen atoms and a chlorine atom that are able to pull the minus away from H. Also, remember that these particular anions often are delocalized by resonance. Any one of the resonance structures shown really doesn't adequately describe the anion. For instance, if we look at the chlorate anion, the electrons in chlorate are delocalized by resonance. This tells us that the chlorate ion has an ability to spread out electron density. This ability to spread out electron density means that it's likely better able to hold minus, spread it out, and remain stable.